Thank you, Parikshit. Hello to all of you again. Our session today, or this session is called The Geopolitical Calculus, the India Theorem, where we shall examine India's evolving role in global affairs. The international order is growing more complex by the day. It is becoming more multipolar. And India stands at a unique crossroads. We are strategically autonomous, economically ambitious, and increasingly influential. So in this conversation, we hope to unpack India's moves and try and figure out what it reveals about the shifting global order. Dr. Abrahms, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Great to be here.
What, according to you, is the India theorem? How do you see India balancing politics, power, pragmatism, and principle in foreign policy?
Sure. I think that principle and power is a really good place to start in terms of understanding the nature of U.S. relations with India. I think that the United States is very sort of hot on India, if you will, very close with India because of our shared principle, because of democracy. India is the largest democracy in the world, but also increasingly important because of its power. And we've already seen many speakers talk about the nature of that power in terms of India's economic power and its demographic power, but particularly now from the US strategic perspective, India is seen as critical in terms of its power for containing China. And so this administration, although in a way it's all over the place, you know, with the tariffs and the Ukraine war and Hamas and Iran and the Houthis, there's no issue geopolitically of greater concern to this administration than the rise and potential threat of China. And to that end, relations with India are seen as of paramount importance. We also see that more specifically in the so-called Quad relationship.
Yes, but the 26% tariffs does not look like a particularly friendly gesture for a country that is so important to Washington, according to you.
We see this all over the place. For example, Turkey had, their tariff was raised to 10%, and there are increasing U.S. concerns about Turkey's role in the Levant. By contrast, Israel's tariff was raised to 17%. So Israel's tariffs were raised more than Turkey's. The difference between Taiwan and China is relatively small, even though the U.S. views China as an adversary and Taiwan as a critical component against China. So you are right that the tariffs are not based seemingly on Washington's geopolitical love.
Yeah, and the memes last week were that Donald Trump has taxed the penguins, but not Putin. And so the world is still trying to make sense of what this tariff game is. And what is the end game here? Is it just to reduce the trade deficit? Are you trying to really impose reciprocal tariffs, in which case it has been a kind reciprocity, as the president put it? So what is the US president trying to achieve?
I do think deficits are a big part of this, but more interestingly, the United States sees its role as changing in the world. A lot of the international economic system was created by the United States after World War II, and the idea was that the United States was essentially going to underwrite the international economic system. The United States was first in a condition of bipolarity against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And then when the Cold War ended, the US pursued a strategy of primacy to maintain its unipolar position around the world. But increasingly, there's a sense that this unipolar world is ended, or probably more accurately, it has already ended. It's not just ending, but it has ended. And so the United States needs to assume a different position in the world. It can no longer reasonably afford to, have trade imbalances and have a situation where there aren't high tariffs selling into the United States, but in terms of our exports, there are high tariffs. So part of it has to do with the deficit. Part of it has to do with the United States envisioning its role on the world stage differently. But I also think that there's an important domestic politics component to it. The MAGA movement, which helped to elect Donald Trump, many of these voters, they feel like globalization hasn't been good to them. That there are all these billionaires, but they are not really accruing in the financial benefits, especially after the Biden years when there was, runaway inflation, and yet their income really didn't go up all that much. And so there's this idea that perhaps globalization hasn't been great for the so-called everyday American, in that we need more sort of manufacturing happening inside the United States. I'm not saying that I endorse that view, but it is an important one to understand Donald Trump's economic policies.
Yes, because economists clearly do not understand what he's trying to do, and there are protests in the US and people apparently cannot afford eggs for Easter and so on. But focusing on India at the moment, what does it mean for India at a time when it is trying to position itself as a manufacturing hub in a post-China recalibration? Do you see this as an opportunity for India for self-reliance or maybe deeper South-South trade partnerships?
It probably will have a good effect by showing that, the United States cannot 100% be relied upon as a pillar, and that this will actually induce American allies to become more autonomous, to diversify their economic relations. But I do think that India is in a very good position to accelerate the strong bilateral relationship with the United States. I'm sure you've seen some of the headlines, but my understanding is that the US and India are not going to let, this tariff conversation over the past couple weeks derail their relationship, and they are going to find some kind of a bilateral solution which actually could put the US and India on stronger relations economically relative to other relationships that the United States has around the world. It does seem that, in my opinion, the best approach is for countries to say to the Trump administration that they understand and that they want to work out some kind of a mutually beneficial relationship rather than reverting to some kind of a reciprocal punishment. Netanyahu, the head of Israel, was just at the White House, and that was basically his approach, that he understood what Trump was doing, and that because of the importance of that relationship, he's going to try to find a way to make moves which will, make both sides happy. I think that is the best approach, because the truth is it seems to me that Donald Trump does place a lot of weight on personal relationships. And so to the extent that those personal relationships can be fostered in a beneficial way, I do think that it could have important financial implications for the rest of us.
You're saying the best policy is for world leaders to try and woo Trump. Where does that leave multilateral institutions? Is this the end of multilateralism and globalization? Some countries are looking to go to the WTO, but it may take years for any sort of resolution there.
You know, it is true that this administration, I think, places less emphasis on international institutions and multilateralism. It tends to view relationships as transactional rather than sort of ideological or necessarily enduring. And so I do think that multilateralism will still be a factor to the extent that it's seen by Washington as expedient. But to the extent that it's not, I don't think that this administration is going to be paying much lip service to it. That's very different than the Biden administration, which viewed some of these international institutions as sacrosanct.
Right. How do you see India's position on the wars in Gaza and Ukraine? There was a fair bit of lecturing and virtue signaling from the West, a lot of pressure as well, as India tried to prioritize its national interest and old relationships over headline-grabbing statements. But in hindsight and over the years, do you think that this was actually mature diplomacy?
So much to say on this topic. But, you know, I come to India pretty regularly and do a lot of interaction with India. And a lot of people ask me, like, well, you know, why is that? You know, because you're mostly known as like a counterterrorism guy in the security space. And one of the things that I really like about India, which other people might not bring up, is that India takes counterterrorism very seriously. It has a very good understanding of the dangers of terrorism and the importance of combating it. It is certainly true that India tries to be more, quote-unquote, even-handed on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than, say, the Trump administration, which is unabashedly pro-Israel.
Yeah. There's
no doubt that that's true. But at the same time, I think that from the vantage of Jerusalem, that New Delhi is seen as a very reliable and strong partner. And that's because of their mutual understanding about the importance of counterterrorism. I believe that Modi reached out to Netanyahu very shortly after the 10/7 Hamas massacre. And certain, you know, Israel is a very small country, and India is a very big country. And from Israel's perspective, that bilateral relationship is extraordinarily important.
How does the West see India's focus on multilateral groups like the Quad or the SC or the BRICS? Do they see it as a form of hedging or bandwagoning, or do they see it as a genuine attempt to build a multilateral global order?
I think that the United States has been deeply influenced by an intellectual paradigm in international relations called realism, which tends to really emphasize sort of, you know, realpolitik and great power politics. And to that end, the United States is very concerned about the rise of China. Not only China becoming a regional hegemon, but essentially challenging the United States' primacy around the world. Realism also tends to emphasize that there are very real limits on how much power projection any one country can do, and that, the U.S. economy, although big, is actually finite. And so these multilateral institutions, especially like the Quad, are seen as really important for the United States containing China, but not doing it alone, doing it with allies, which is much more sustainable economically.
But they don't like BRICS.
I'm sorry?
They're good with Quad, but they don't like BRICS.
I just happen to know more about the international security space, and I do think it is of a greater priority to the Pentagon.
How do you assess India's deterrence posture vis-a-vis Pakistan and China at a time when, the nature of conflict is evolving. We're talking about hybrid conflict doctrines and limited war. How do you see India positioned against its two neighbors?
I wish we had another analyst up here who was really sort of a Pakistan expert in particular. But I do think that India really prioritizes counterterrorism. There's an interesting new development, which I don't want to go on record and sort of ratify it, but based on news stories over the past 24 hours, maybe you have seen them, is that the United States is returning to Bagram Air Base. Have you seen this?
Yes.
Can you confirm? So it hasn't been formally announced by either
I saw some reports.
Either the Taliban or Washington, but this is a really sort of fascinating development. Post 9/11, the United States goes into Afghanistan, tries to occupy the country for 2 decades, finally leaves, and now, interestingly, is returning. And I think that it has to do with not so much the counterterrorism threat. In fact, I believe that the Taliban has invited the Pentagon in. It's not against the wishes of the Taliban, but if you look at where the Bagram Air Base is, it is very conveniently located in terms of dealing with Iran, in terms of dealing with China. And I do think that this is kind of a microcosm of the geopolitical changes that we're seeing, where the United States, of course, post 9/11, was most interested in the war on terrorism.
Right.
And now the United States has chosen to go back to Bagram Air Base, not primarily for counterterrorism, although it will, be fighting, hopefully with the Taliban against the Islamic State province there, but primarily in terms of dealing with the Iranian threat.
Right,
and I know
that's an interesting...
The reason why I say that is because I know that this is an issue that is of regional importance to India as well.
Absolutely, and we see how the conversation on that front is going. Final question, we have a minute and a half. I want to ask you this. There's been another report of Trump announcing a $1 trillion defense budget. What does it say about the president's priorities?
Well, like many politicians, I think that Trump has goals which in some ways can be inconsistent. And one of them is reducing the deficit. But Trump also sees himself as, a really sort of iconic figure in terms of the United States' role around the world. So there isn't actually that much sort of energy in reducing the U.S.'s expenditure on the military, but at the same time, one of the biggest stories so far in this administration has been DOGE, right, and sort of cost-cutting by Elon Musk. The reality is that although I support the cost-cutting and many of the expenditures were on all sorts of nonsense, some of those cuts, if you look at them numerically, are actually quite small compared to, say, the cost of an aircraft carrier, or the cost of a bomber. So I think that Washington is trying to reduce its budget, but doing so in a way which will not diminish its military.
More noise, less substance, so far. Thank you, Dr. Max Abrahms, for your thoughts and for your insights. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Max and Palki, for that very interesting session on geopolitics and the divide in the world today. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's now shift focus to another aspect of geopolitics, oil and gas. As we know, energy security is a critical aspect of any nation's growth and development, and India is really no exception. With our growing economy and increasing energy demands, we need to think strategically. Over the last few years, India has been making innovative and bold geostrategic moves on the oil front. We are also increasing our crude oil suppliers, adding new countries and diversifying our energy mix. So what does this really mean for a young India? How can our youth tap into these opportunities and contribute to our country's energy future? These are just some of the questions we will be exploring in the next session with Hardeep Singh Puri, Honorable Union Minister for Petroleum and Natural Gas. He will be in a fireside chat on how